What really happened during Jesus' 3 days in the tomb? Jesus died on the cross, but what really happened during the 3 days before his resurrection? Did he simply remain in the tomb? Did he descend into hell? Was there a spiritual battle taking place? For centuries, believers and skeptics alike have asked these questions. The Bible gives us clues, but many people are surprised to discover that those 3 days were not a period of defeat. They were part of God's plan for the greatest victory in history. After hours of suffering on the cross, Jesus cried out, "It is finished." Then he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." At that moment, Jesus died. His body was taken down from the cross and placed in a new tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. A large stone sealed the entrance, and Roman guards were stationed outside to prevent anyone from stealing the body. To everyone watching, the story seemed over. The disciples were devastated. They had left everything to follow Jesus. They believed he was the promised Messiah who would save Israel. But now their teacher was dead. Fear replaced faith. Confusion replaced hope. They hid behind locked doors, uncertain about what would happen next. Everything they had dreamed about seemed to have been shattered. Yet while the disciples were mourning, heaven was not in panic. God had not lost control. Nothing had happened by accident. Jesus had predicted his death and resurrection several times. He told his followers that he would be killed and that on the 3rd day he would rise again. But in their grief, they struggled to understand his words. One of the most debated questions is where Jesus was during those 3 days. Some Christians point to passages such as 1 Peter 3:18-20 and Ephesians 4:8-10 and believe that Christ ascended to proclaim his victory. Others understand these passages differently. Throughout church history, believers have discussed these verses, but they all agree on one central truth. Jesus was carrying out the Father's plan, and death would not have the final word. Meanwhile, the religious leaders probably thought they had succeeded. They had silenced Jesus. The Roman authorities believed they had ended a problem. Even Satan and the powers of darkness may have thought they had won. But what they considered a victory was actually their greatest defeat. The cross was not Satan's triumph, it was his downfall. The silence of those 3 days must have felt unbearable. There were no miracles, no crowds, no sermons, no signs that anything extraordinary was about to happen. But God's silence does not mean God's absence. Often when we cannot see him working, he is preparing something greater than we can imagine. The 3rd day was deeply significant. Jesus had compared himself to Jonah, who spent 3 days in the belly of the great fish before being delivered. Prophecies in the Old Testament pointed toward the suffering and ultimate victory of the Messiah. Everything was happening according to God's perfect timing. Nothing was delayed, nothing was forgotten. Then, early in the morning, something happened that changed history forever. Women came to the tomb expecting to find a dead body. Instead, they found the stone rolled away. The tomb was empty. Angels announced the incredible news. He is not here. He has risen. Death had been defeated. Sin had been conquered. The grave had lost its power. Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, exactly as he promised. The resurrection was more than a miracle. It was proof that Jesus is who he claimed to be. It showed that his sacrifice on the cross had been accepted, and that forgiveness and eternal life are available to everyone who believes in him. And perhaps that's the lesson we need most today. Those 3 days looked like failure. They looked like darkness. They looked like silence. But behind the scenes, God was preparing a victory that nobody expected. Maybe you're in your own 3 days right now. Maybe you're waiting for answers, praying for a breakthrough, or wondering why God seems silent. The empty tomb reminds us that God's silence is not his absence. The darkest Friday was followed by Resurrection Sunday. And when God makes a promise, he always keeps it. Because the story didn't end with a sealed tomb. It ended with an empty tomb. And that changed everything forever. If this message encouraged you, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs hope today. because Jesus is alive, and that truth still changes lives.